Committee of the Baltimore County Bar Association. I hope you all are staying somewhat dry today, and at least out my way. We've got about 6 inches on the ground, and it's still coming. We are privileged to have today Dean Russell McLean from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law, the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, and a dad. And he is, without a doubt, I think we're in for quite a treat today in terms of handling this courageous conversation. I will be stepping out and turning it over to him, but just to give a shameless plug for our committees. This is the sort of the capstone of the beginning of a hopefully a long program for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee with their 21-week challenge. We're still obviously looking for donors, but thank you to the donors that have already stepped up and have become sponsors. This will be just a game changer, and that's what we're looking for. Same thing with the Professionals Committee. We're really hoping that this is a series that we can continue on, allowing these discussions and educating everybody along the way. And I wish everybody a good learning opportunity. Sandy, anything else?
No, I think you said it all, Ari. I'm Sandy Steves. I'm the events chair for the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. It's a new committee for our Bar Association that's been started in the last 12 months. I would say it was probably the brainchild of our former president, Michael Seary, who's been instrumental in getting the committee off the ground. And we've gotten great support from our current president, Jay Miller. And this is really the first program that we've been able to put on with the pandemic. And we're honored to have Dean McLean, and we thank him for taking time away from his family. He's getting ready to go out and play with his children in the snow, where I just got in from. And with that, I think we would turn it over to Dean McLean and let him start the presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Sandy and Ari and Rachel, who's also with us. So I really appreciate the invitation. And Judge Seary as well, and others who are part of the Diversity and Inclusion Committee of the Baltimore County Bar Association. So I'm really excited to be here, to have an opportunity to chat with you a little bit today. We're doing this because of the number of respondents. We're doing this in webinar format, which means I don't get to see all of your faces, but I will just assume that you're laughing at my jokes and you think I'm really good looking and things like that. I'm just going to assume all positive feedback for myself, just to boost my own ego. I should say before I get started that Ari has been particularly helpful in getting me ready for this event, keeping me on track. And even in our prep call 2 days ago, he reminded me at the very end of the call, just so that I wouldn't screw this up. He said, don't forget to wear pants. So here I am. I'm happy to have a chance to talk to you, and I am indeed clothed. So I'm happy to see you. And as we go, I think that Rachel may be putting in the chat one more time a website that'll be great for you to go to. You can do it on your phone or on your computer. I'm going to ask you a handful of questions here at the beginning, just to get a sense of who you all are. So this will give us a chance to interact a little bit. Just so that I can maybe kind of set the agenda for today. My hope is to spend a little bit of time here talking to you about implicit bias specifically, and other things that might have an impact on the administration of justice and the ways in which we engage with the world in our profession. And so, and then I would like to have us, in the second half of our time together today, really spend some energy thinking about how this might have an impact on us personally. So I do hope that today will be interactive. Please, as Rachel has just posted, please, if you have questions, feel free to post them in the chat. You can send a Q&A. I think through one or both of those, you can send messages publicly, or you can, or as Rachel has just said, you can just choose to send them to panelists. And so if you would like to send messages and you don't necessarily want your name associated with it, but you have a question you'd like to ask, I hope you'll ask it and just send it to us and we won't read your name. What I'm hoping that we'll create here is a space where we can have a genuine and productive conversation on issues that can be challenging. And I think Ari's title for this session, Courageous Conversations, is apt. So I'm really looking forward to it. So with that said, I'm going to start out here by sharing my screen. I will go back and forth from sharing and not sharing because it can be hard to stare at a PowerPoint for 90 minutes. But let me at least start here. So I'm going to try to see if I can get you to answer a few questions for me. So looks like you're already in the mode. So I'm going to give this a minute. I got 4 or 5 of these questions here at the beginning just to get a sense of who you are and how you're thinking. If you've never used anything like this, this is called a word cloud. And what's cool about it is it doesn't just show the responses, but the more of you who use a particular response, the bigger the word gets. So it's kind of cool to see common sets of characteristics across the group. Here it looks like honesty, justice, compassion, fairness, loyalty, empathy are shared characteristics. See, inclusion, anti-racism are growing. Kindness is over there in the corner, but I appreciate that one. I like that one a lot. Courage, service. So thank you for this. Just in the interest of time, because I could do this for about 10 minutes, but in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the next of my 4 or 5 questions here. So I'm just interested really quickly in I feel like I've been in my basement where I am right now for about a year. And I'm wondering kind of what you've missed most while you've been what have you missed most the past year? Somebody's missed eating. According to Ari, we can all get Chick-fil-A, apparently. So that's an option that's on the table. That would look like it's invariably the case that the thing we miss most, right, is being with other people. Look at that, friends, hugs, human interaction. And I do think I saw somebody who said happy hour. All right. Another question for you here. I have some friends who went to the Galapagos about a few weeks ago and really enjoyed it. I've never been. This is awesome. Thank you. All right, I'm going to keep moving as much as I enjoy this. Now, here's a more serious question. I wonder kind of how do you feel like we're going to talk about bias, race, gender, other kinds of issues, and I'm wondering how does that, what kind of feelings does that evoke in you? And as these are popping in, I want to observe, like I pay less attention here to kind of how big words get. And I'm much more interested in the range of responses. And so like we see big words like excited and necessary, but I do want you to see uncomfortable is there, right? And awkward and curious, anxiety, scared are also in the mix, skeptical's in the mix, trepidation. And so I want you to know at least that I appreciate that there are a range of feelings about this in the room. And so I hope that you can feel like this is an opportunity for you to participate in this, in a conversation where all of you should have an opportunity to feel like you get something of value out of this. And that's my big hope. So thank you for being honest and sharing these reactions with me. And finally, what is it that you hope to get out of this? And these are going to show up not in a word cloud, but on lines. You can type full sentences if you wish to. I just want to give this a little bit of time so that I can have a sense for what you're hoping for. And so I do see a lot are looking for insight, looking to learn. Some are looking for kind of really concrete, I'm paraphrasing, but some concrete perspectives and concrete steps, things to do. And so I really do hope between today's session and the session we have in 2 weeks that you'll feel like you have some concrete takeaways. And I think we'll start that conversation today and see how far we get. But it does take a little time to work through all of this. So thank you. This is great. So thank you so much. And this, you'll be able to keep responding to this, and I can come back and even check it after our session today. So I really appreciate your sharing this with me. As we get started, I want to maybe kind of think about how we can establish a framework for courageous conversations. So a lot of times, I imagine you've heard kind of this reference in the past few years to safe spaces. And I don't love that term. And part of the reason I don't love it is because it seems to indicate kind of an absence of risk, right? An absence of perspectives that might make us uncomfortable. And so I want to create a slightly different environment here, one that isn't necessarily safe and does require us to be a little bit brave, a little bit courageous. And so instead of safe, I'm a law professor, so I had to come up with a clever acronym, and my acronym is HAVEN. And here is my thinking on this, and I'd love to get your reactions on whether you think this is a good fit for this conversation. So my H is for humility. And this really refers to the idea that none of us is perfect, right? We all have room to grow, right? Not I and none of the participants here has the monopoly on insight. And so we're all here to learn from each other. And so I hope we can enter the space with kind of a bit of humility. I'm asking also if you will come to the space with authenticity and transparency. You don't have to, at least for these 90 minutes, be anybody other than who you are. If you have a question you want to ask, I hope you'll ask it. Do not worry about offending me, and don't worry about being judged. And again, if you're concerned at all, please just send a private message to the panelists, and I can answer the question without using your name. It's important to me that you get to ask tough questions and questions that you might be nervous to ask. So I hope you'll feel like you can do that here. I'm gonna add vulnerability to the list, and the idea here is that if we expect other people to be open and to ask tough questions, that we have to be prepared to feel uncomfortable, right? Things people say or think might not sit with us the right way, but I think we have to have a real conversation. We have to be open to a little bit of discomfort for all of us. E is for empathy, and really just recognizing that not everyone looks at the world through the same lens through which we might look at the world. And so just being open to the perspectives of others. And then finally, I'll add here, non-judgment. And at least for this time, I would ask of all of you to give me space to make mistakes, right? I told you, at the beginning of this list that I'm not perfect. I will certainly give you room to make, maybe what I might think is a mistake, and I hope you'll give me that space too. And I particularly hope you'll do that for each other, right? So that we can have a real conversation and kind of build bridges and have an opportunity to kind of talk. So let me just stop sharing for a second and see what your perspective is on that. I see that there are a lot of chat messages, and I just want to make sure that I'm not missing any questions. I know that Rachel has an eye on what's happening in the chat, so that's good. But any thoughts on Haven? At least Diane seems to, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, seems to like it. But any suggestions of other things that we might have as a part of this conversation before we go on? And if not, that's okay. Thanks, Melanie. All right, so let's jump in. I just want to talk a little bit about. I'm going to share a few things about myself as we go, just to give you some insight. Let me say that if you have questions, throw them in as soon as you're ready. Don't wait to, for a break in the action. Rachel and Ari particularly are watching the chat, and we'll just answer the questions as you are sending them in. So first thing I want to tell you about myself is that I am, I don't know, cheap, maybe frugal is the right word. I drive a Prius. I don't know how many of you drive a Prius, but my Prius was the first car that I had. I mean, I got it a while ago, but it was the first car I ever owned that had the key where you didn't have to take the key out of your pocket, right? Like it was just nice. You can walk up to the car and the door just opens, right? And like that key can just stay in my pocket all day. And so I bought this Prius at a time when gas was like $4 a gallon, and I had an SUV, and it was killing me to drive from Virginia at the time to Baltimore every day. So I as a part of my cheapness, I should say that I like to bargain shop. Like I'm a person who I don't buy anything at regular price, and I buy, like if it's on sale, I might buy it even if I don't need it. But like I do things like shopping at like Target, or like even better, like I'll go to like Marshalls. I don't know if anybody shops at Marshalls. So like, and I can only see a couple of you, but I see some participants raising their hands, right? So you guys know Marshalls or like Ross Dress for Less. I'm the person who goes into Marshalls, but I don't like, sorry, let me back up. For those of you who don't know what Marshalls is, like if something was on sale, like at Macy's 2 years ago, right? And it was like, they put it on sale, then they put it on clearance at Macy's, and it still didn't sell at Macy's, right? Then like 2 years later, like it makes its way over to Marshalls, right? And that's where you're gonna find me, right? And I don't just like go to Marshalls and buy stuff, right? But I go into Marshalls and I go to the clearance rack at Marshalls. Let me just explain what that means. That means that when I go to Marshalls, like I'm buying the stuff that has been at Marshalls for a year and still hasn't sold, right? And so like they're giving it away. Like often it's like a suit that might not have pants, right? Or it's a there's one out of 3 pieces available, or a shirt might be missing a sleeve, but it's on sale. And I learned at a very young age that if something is on sale and you buy it, you are saving money, right? And so I feel like that's a kind of a strong value in my life and for my family. So I'm coming out of Marshalls one day, and I've got my hands full of things that I didn't need, but I've saved money. And I get to my Prius, and I go to open the door, right? Key fob's in my pocket. I go to open the door, and my car door doesn't open. I kind of shift all the backs to one hand, and there's a little sensor on the inside of the handle, as you know. So I kind of get my hand there under the sensor, right, and get a good grip on it and pull, and my car door still doesn't open. So I'm a little bit annoyed, but now I have to do the thing that I learned I didn't have to do, right? I go in and I pull out the key fob and I press unlock, and my car still won't open. There's an unlock button on the door handle, and I press that and my car won't open. So now I've gone to, from what was like euphoria coming out of Marshalls, right, to now I'm annoyed, a little bit frustrated. I don't know what's going on. Maybe the battery in my key is dead. Maybe the battery in my car is dead. I don't know what's wrong. I'm gonna have to call AAA and get a tow or a jump. And like my mood has changed palpably, right, tangibly. And I'm into this for a good minute or two, at which point I realized, oh, that's not my car. I was at the wrong car, and I'd spent like a good couple of minutes trying to get into the wrong car. Now this I don't know if this has happened to anybody else, right? But this is a thing. It's actually happened to me like 3 like definitive times in my life where I have gotten into or tried to get into the wrong car. The most recent of which was at Royal Farms. And I went to get some ice, and I went after I came out, I put the ice in the back of my SUV and had an opportunity to have a short conversation with a woman in the driver's seat of that car who was not my wife. So I wonder in these moments, kind of, why is it that I can, like, it's hard for me to kind of figure out like why my car won't open, right? What is it happening in my brain that is having an impact? And it's actually affecting my mood, right? And part of it, I think, is that my brain has already decided this is my car. So my brain has nowhere to kind of place the information, right? To kind of rationalize why why my car won't open, right? And it goes to kind of the worst case scenario. And I'm pretty interested in how the brain works and how it affects the way we think, the way we feel, and some of the decisions that we end up making. And that, to me, is kind of a basis for talking a little bit here about implicit bias. So I'm going to kind of jump back into my PowerPoint for a second. And so when we think about bias, I'm going to focus first on what we call subconscious bias, though do know that the term implicit bias might really make reference to a number of things, right? It can refer to the way our brains work, subconscious bias. It can also refer to kind of bias within systems, right? So some people might suggest that that there is bias in the judicial system, right? Or bias within organizations, right? A firm, right, or a school or other kind of organization might have kind of built-in, institutionalized bias. And so I'm going to focus first, at least, here on the idea of subconscious bias. And so here's your brain. We're going to think about what's going on in the brain. If you're old enough, that's kind of funny. So there's this theory of information processing. It's called information processing theory, and it likens our brain to a computer. And that brain computer takes in information, it processes it, and some of that information may get discarded. Other information works its way into long-term memory. And so and the way our brains work, and sorry, I just got distracted. Something weird just happened to the chat. I don't know if you saw that, Rachel. Something weird on my chat just happened, but hopefully it'll be okay. I'm
sorry, Russell. One of the attendees, Mary, I think you were holding down the period or something like that.
Okay, no, it's fine. It caught me out of the corner of my eye. So the way that this process works is that our brains kind of take information in, process it, and then our brains have to have a way of organizing information. And so what's important is, if you can see on the right side of your screen, are these categories or schemata or schemas, we might call them. Basically, I think of them like buckets. Right? Our brains going to take in all of this information, and things get sorted into buckets. And things that are alike kind of go into the same bucket. Right? Imagine you're cleaning out your garage and there's lots of tools and parts and things on the ground. Like you might put all the nuts and bolts into one bucket and all the kind of, hammers and screwdrivers into another bucket or something like that. Another way to think about it would be, I don't know if anybody's old enough to, I feel like I'm getting older and my references maybe don't always work, but is anybody old enough to remember I Love Lucy? So I can only see reactions of 3 of you, but at least they seem to be nodding. So some of you are raising your hands now, right? So if you know I Love Lucy, then you know this episode where they're working in the candy factory, right? And there's all this candy kind of coming down the conveyor belt, and Lucy, and I think her friend's name is Ethel, does that sound right? Where, had to sort it into boxes, and it was just overwhelming, right? The way that this candy started coming down the aisle, and the hilarious part is, right, when Lucy starts kind of jamming it into her mouth in order to, to kind of keep up with the pace. Well, our brains could kind of get overwhelmed with all the input that we get over time. At any given moment, we're just being bombarded with visual, auditory, and other sensory data. And as a result, our brains have to engage in this process that you're looking at on the screen subconsciously, right? So our brains do the sorting function without our always being consciously aware of it. And so our brains alone kind of recognize patterns and begin to respond to those patterns. So let me give you an example. At my house, I'm responsible for mowing the lawn. And I was, this is now a couple of years ago, mowing the lawn. And as I'm mowing, I come across a little, in the backyard, I see 6 or 8 little things kind of moving through the ground like this, right? Now, in hindsight, what I can tell you is that they were little baby snakes, right? And I should also tell you that I like snakes. I think snakes are kind of cool. And so I'm not like particularly troubled by them. I enjoy them. I don't necessarily I don't want to be bitten by a snake, but I don't mind, harmless snakes. And so I know a lot of things about snakes. Some people eat snakes. They can be slippery. They can be big. I didn't really think about the fact at the time that, if you see 6 baby snakes, that there might be a parent snake around, but I don't really know how snakes live. But I come up on this little nest of snakes. There are all these things that I know about snakes. And so I want to just kind of ask if you have any thoughts on whether I kind of ran through kind of all the information I know about snakes in that moment. Just like, you can throw it in the chat if you want. Like, what do you think I did when I came across this bed of snakes? And my chat's still looking a little bit funny, but even Rachel or Ari or Sandy, feel free to unmute. Just tell me what you think.
Turntail ran inside.
Turntail ran inside. Teresa's
I would think
that.
you were startled and didn't consider everything that you knew about snakes.
Right.
I like this answer. Absolutely. Use those assumptions to keep yourself safe.
Right. So jumped, ran inside, right? Use those assumptions to keep myself safe. I ran over the buggers. So Stephen thinks that I'm into killing snakes. All right. So, right. Douglas kind of says, no, you acted on instinct, right? John says, let him go, scream. So I didn't, Melanie, I didn't scream. You might call it a squeal, right? Like there was a sound that came out of me. Right. And so I think all of you kind of get the idea, right? That in that moment, even though there's things I consciously know, like I have a default in my brain, right? And this is how I kind of think of it. What I think of is that the default in my brain is anything small and moving on the ground, like default dangerous, right? Now I can kind of take a step back, assess, right? But my initial reaction, right, is to shout, to jump, to kind of move away, not to mow them over, right? To eventually, I go and I get my kids and say, hey, come look at something cool, right? But in that moment, right, I have a physical and emotional reaction to the stimulus that I have, right? I have this immediate reaction, and so and you can kind of think about how this might work, in your own homes. Like right now, many of you, I assume, are sitting down, but I'm guessing if something just kind of moved across the corner of the wall there in whatever room you're in, you might jump for a second, before you kind of realize that maybe it's something harmless, maybe it's not, but we might have a reaction, right? Unless you have a cat or something that's running around all the time, right? That you're kind of used to those things. And so our brains kind of work in this way, right? That the inputs that we get over time kind of create categories in our brains, and we have kind of these defaults that we go to that may or may not be consistent with the way that we think, right? I like snakes, but my default reaction was really to kind of view this as and treat this as a dangerous situation. And I could, upon reflection, kind of change that response. So and what I want to get across is that this way that our brains work is a normal response, right? It's appropriate, it is necessary, it is not a fault. Not only is it not our fault, it is not a fault at all. Our brains have to do this, right? We wouldn't be able to function unless our brains were engaging in this process. And so a lot of times when we hear people talk about implicit bias, and particularly in the context of individual bias, it's kind of used as an accusation, right? This idea that like you're being biased, like that was biased, and it feels like you're being charged with something, right? Like I feel like I'm being charged with being a racist or a sexist or some other kind of ist or phobe. And so what I really want to try to communicate here is that perhaps it's not that, right? But perhaps our brains are working on their own without our conscious involvement. This operation of the brain is normal. It's natural, it's necessary, and it's not inherently insidious or problematic, but it can be problematic when we think about the idea that not only do we sort snakes and all the other kinds of things that we interact with in the world, we also sort people, right? And it's based on what's coming down the conveyor belt, right? If we kind of think about this idea, right, that the categories depend upon the input that we get, right? That things that are alike kind of get sorted together, then what comes down the conveyor belt kind of necessarily dictates what the categories are going to be. And so based on the kind of social input that we get, our brains sort people into different categories as well. And that can operate in a way that might be insidious, right? So it might be as simple as I just have a slightly more positive feeling about someone or a slightly less positive feeling about somebody. Maybe something that is barely perceptible, but just might tip the scales, right, in terms of how I feel about a person. It doesn't have to be that I jump in fear, right, or that I, that my heart starts beating faster, but maybe it's just an intuition. Maybe it's just a sense that this is somebody I like or somebody that I'm, I feel less kind of affinity towards. So I want to talk for just a quick second about the Harvard Implicit Association test. And I'm wondering how many of you have ever taken it. I'm sorry, I'm going to clear these responses for just a second. So if you responded, please respond again if you're online. But I just wanted to get a sense for how many of you might have taken the Harvard Implicit Association test. I'm going to give this a minute just so I can get a sense. I know we've got about 80 something participants, so it might just take a second. And I do see that some people are raising hands. I think I'm taking that to mean that you're saying, yes, I have. Okay, so it seems to be kind of settling out at around 40 have, 60 haven't. I want to spend maybe just a few minutes for those of you who have not, just talking about the Harvard Implicit Association test, just as a window into kind of how this gets studied and the way that it's studied, and to give you some insight. I'd actually like to suggest that for those of you particularly who are coming back in 2 weeks, that you try doing one of these, but I want to talk to you about it first. So here's a little bit about the Harvard Implicit Association test. On the screen, you can see a screenshot from the test. If you go to, if you ever want to do this, you can just Google Harvard IAT, and maybe Rachel can put that in the chat, but you can Google that. Your first link that'll come up will be to Project Implicit, and you can click the sublink that says take a test. But you'll find that there are 15 or so different implicit association tests that you can take. The one that we're looking at on the screen is a screenshot from the race IAT, but they also have kind of a gender science, gender career, religion, skin tone, body type, sexuality, IAT, among others. And so let me just describe how the test works and what it's doing, what it's actually measuring. So on the screen here, you see 4 categories, right? 2 categories are words, 2 categories are pictures. In the first category, you see positive words like spectacular and fabulous. In the second category, you see negative words like disaster and humiliate. The third category are faces you would recognize as being Black or African American. And the final category would be faces you would recognize as being Caucasian or white. And what the test does through a series of 8 or 9 iterations is asks you to see how quickly you can connect an idea, connect some of these things together. So it might start out by saying, click the left side of the screen if you're using a touch screen, or click the I or the E key. So let's say the E key if you see a black face, and the I key if you see a face that's white. And it'll kind of go through a series of just flashing pictures, and you're supposed to, as quickly as you can, select the correct answer. And then what it will do, we'll do that with words, likewise, just do positive words, then negative words. But then what it will do is begin to connect ideas. So it will say, for example, if you see a black face or a positive word, click the right side. If you see a white face or a negative word, click the left side. It'll switch sides and switch connections. So you'll have black and negative, white and positive on, and all variations on either side. And what it is doing is simply measuring how quickly, and this might be, fractions of a second, but how quickly do you get to the correct answer? Right? Do you get to the correct answer more quickly, for example, if you are trying to connect black and positive versus black and negative, right? Is there a difference in your response time? And that's all it's really measuring. I point that out because I think a lot of times when people talk about the implicit association test, some might view it as like a test of whether or not you're a racist. So if you take this and you score badly on it, like you're a racist, right? And that's not what this test is doing, right? What this test is really doing is just like observing how long does it take us to connect certain ideas. And let me just describe for you my first experience doing this test. The first time I ever did it was this test, the race test. I'm an African-American man, and I felt pretty comfortable taking it. I'm pretty clear that I don't have biases against people who are Black. And so I take the test, and at the end of the test, it prints out a result and says, or publishes a result to the screen and says, which says for me, you have shown a either mild or moderate bias in favor of whites and against African Americans. That was a little unsettling for me as an African American man, right? Like that bothered me. And so that was before I'd spent a lot of time kind of looking into what this study is doing and thinking about it a bit. And here's what I think is important to gather from this. Now, this isn't about like, are you a racist? It's not about, are you a good or bad person? But it is important information maybe to know that it was easier in my brain, right, to make a connection between Black and negative than Black and positive. Like that's just useful information for me to have, right? And just to know that that's potentially there. And that maybe if I'm aware of that, that might make a difference in some of the ways that I engage with the world around me. So I did see some chat messages kind of pop in. And so I just want to make sure I respond to it. So someone has posted here that in the gender career test that this person skewed against women in the workplace, right? And this is somebody who's the executive director of the Women's Law Center of Maryland, right? And so I think that it is really important to observe, and thank you so much for posting that. It's really important to observe that the bias and the way that this might measure bias is not necessarily consistent with the way that we think consciously, right? In other words, that it is possible for these contradictions to exist, right? That we can both be subconsciously biased, right? Or at least subconsciously have a more difficult time associating certain kinds of concepts rather than other kinds of concepts. But nevertheless be egalitarian, unbiased when we are kind of thinking about things consciously. And so here's a comment that I think it's how we've been raised, and everything that you've seen in the media still skews towards traditional gender roles. I think this is responding to Douglas's comment. And I think that that's really an important thing, and it kind of is a perfect opportunity for me to segue into the next topic, which is really thinking about how do our biases come into being, right? How do our biases develop? And so again, if you look at the screen, you kind of think about how these categories develop, and that the categories kind of are direct responses to the inputs that we get. It's important to think about the inputs. I'm going to show you a few inputs, and these are just random examples that exist. You know, these kinds of things are ubiquitous, but I just want to show you a couple of things here that are at least illustrative of what I'm talking about. So let's think for a second about the inputs that we get, right? What do you see when you turn on the news and that might tell you who's dangerous? This is in advertising. I don't know how many of you ever saw this. I think this was an advertisement that was a few years ago now from Dove, but the essence of this part of the ad is, you know, use Dove and it will make, oops, excuse me, use Dove and it'll make you clean, kind of moving from the top left to the bottom right. You can see the message that would send. Again, you know, something that we might not perceive necessarily as we're watching the commercial, but might nevertheless, right, have an impact on us. So yes, Doug. So yes, Douglas, WTF. That seems like a response we can have. So here's an American Red Cross flyer that went out a few years ago to households about pool safety. I'll just give you a second to look at it. Right, and I think you can see, right, that, and I'm not going to ask for volunteers, but you can see that as you look at this, that most, not all, but most of the not cool behavior involves a person of color, right? And maybe, you know, kind of looking at it in the other way, most, if not all, of the people of color are engaged in not cool behaviors. I think we have one lifeguard who appears to be a person of color who isn't identified as not cool. So with apologies to those of you who have seen me present on this in other contexts, for those of you who have not, I'm gonna make some reference here and just tell you that I blame it on Kellogg's, right? And so about 3 years ago now, I'm having breakfast with my kids. And I am the dad who gives his kids sugary cereals. Like, that's me. And my kids happen to love me, so there you go, right? So I give my kids sweet cereals. I will sit and eat sweet cereal with them. It is a joy for me to do that. And on the back of this particular box of Kellogg's Corn Pops, which used to be called Sugar Pops when I was a kid, is this scene, right? If you know, on sugary cereals, like on kid cereals, they want to keep you connected to the box, right? They want the kids to keep reading the box, keep eating the cereal, and then that means parents eventually, right, have to buy more cereal, right? It's ingenious marketing, right? So on the back of this box, you see this amazing kind of detailed scene of cartoonish Corn Pops characters playing at the mall. They are, if you look closely, kind of skateboarding down the escalator. They are swimming in the milk fountain. There's somebody kind of jumping down with an umbrella. They're swinging from the rafters. They're having a really good time, right? They're having a lot of fun, and it seems like a blast to be a pop, right? Who doesn't want to be a Kellogg's Corn Pop cartoon Corn Pop here? And everybody's having a good time except for one character on this box, right? And it's somebody who is mopping the floor, wearing denim, you know, listening to their headphones. And I'm going to circle it here at the bottom, circle this one character at the bottom, and I'm going to blow it up, you know, in this, what is, I promise you, an undoctored photo. If we were in person, I'd have the box to show to you. But I assume that as you look at this, again, I'm because I can't see you nodding, but I assume that you can all see, right, that this one character who's mopping the floor, right, or buffing the floor, is the one brown character on the back of the box. Can everybody see that? I think. And so we could spend a lot of time, like with this, with the Dove ad, right, kind of thinking, and with the Red Cross flyer, thinking about, you know, like, who's the person who created this, right? In this situation, it feels insidious to me, right, that somebody had to make a choice here, right, to change the hue of this one character on the back of the box, right? It seems conscious, it seems deliberate. But I'm less concerned about that. Like people will think and do what they want to think or do, but I'm more interested, honestly, for this discussion at least, thinking about what kind of subconscious, subtle way does this have of programming my kids who are looking at the box, right? How does this, along with all the other characters they might see in television and movies and video games, how might that program them to think in a particular way about racial roles and gender roles, right? There are, for those of you who have kids who play video games, for example, like gender roles are pretty dramatically different in video games, right? Women have a particular type in many video games, right? That kind of can program us over time to think of women in a particular way. Think about movies that we see and the types of images that we encounter, and how that might have the effect of programming us in particular ways. I'm just checking the chat here, making sure I haven't missed anything. Rachel, is there anything that you think I've missed here?
There's a couple comments about the decision makers and, are they being silenced? Somebody speaks up in rooms like that. And then the last comment was someone's husband is a graphic designer, and it does sound like they're having this conversation more to avoid things like
okay. Yeah, I mean, I think that, it's again, like somebody did it, I'm sure an artist made the change, and maybe there's an innocent explanation. I tend to agree, and I can only see the beginning of the name, so I'm sorry, with Fatima, that there probably had to be like something that's going to end up like on the shelf at my Safeway, my local Safeway, like that has to go through a number of reviews, both through the ad agency or the graphic designers, and then going back to the corporation and go through series of reviews so that nothing kind of bad slips through the cracks. And you have to think that somebody along the way said, hey, should we do this? And probably somebody else was like, oh, it's fine, right? So I do think that there can be some real problems in the way people kind of are behaving explicitly. I am focusing right now really on like not calling out those people as being bad, but really focusing on kind of how do these images just program us, right? These aren't things, I showed you 5 examples, right? But they aren't unique, right? And they're not limited to race. We see them with gender, we see them with sexuality, we see them with religion. If you think about most television and movies that you have seen, and you see, think about any film, roughly, TV show that you've seen that has a terrorist in it, right? What picture kind of comes to mind, right? There's a certain like prototype of terrorist that comes to mind, and how might that have the impact of programming us, right? So that it's not that we walk around saying that people from a particular religion are bad people. I assume we're not doing that, but on the other hand, right, maybe we feel just slightly uncomfortable, right, when we encounter those who are different from us, right? And that can be problematic. And Fatima, I want to make sure I'm not losing also your point about that people who raise these things can be silenced. And then there's comments also about kind of who's in the room and making decisions about these kinds of things as well. So I just want to make sure. I'm going to trust you, Rachel, to let me know if I'm missing something. I feel like messages are coming in that I may not be seeing. So as we kind of think about how we get programmed, then it's maybe useful just then to focus a little bit on excuse me. Sorry, I've messed up here. I'm trying to share my screen and I've not done a good job of it. To think about the ways in which this might have an impact on the world around us. And so here's where I really want to kind of begin to get you thinking a little bit more about this. So I just want to talk quickly about these areas here. There are studies, many studies in medicine, which is where this has been studied a lot, that actually link measured biases, right? Biases that have been measured on the Harvard IAT to treatment decisions, right? So that, physicians and other healthcare providers, hello, little person Steves, it's good to see you on the screen. I adore little people. So, but that link biases to treatment decisions. There's a study that looks at pediatric patients who are complaining of pain, and it probably wouldn't surprise you to know that the study found that there's a correlation between the bias in healthcare providers that resulted in differences in the amount of pain medication, the type of pain medication that was given to students of, patients of color versus patients who were white. And women are more likely, for example, to be diagnosed with depression, which may be really kind of stereotypically viewed as a more female characteristic. In employment, I assume all of you are aware, and if not, you probably should be, right? But all of you, I assume all of you are aware that if you take identical resumes and simply change the name and then post it on a job search site, that the name that is more kind of European sounding in origin versus the name that sounds more ethnic is more likely to get callbacks, right? So I'm trying to remember now the name of the article, but it is literally something like, do John and Jane, have an advantage over LaShawn and whatever. And so there was a real, there are studies that kind of show the difference that we can, in decision making that are connected to these things, right? And again, not that we sorry, I'm laughing at Ari's message that he just took the race IAT and it showed no automatic preference, which is amazing, except that now, Ari, you've just told us that you took the IAT like literally while this is going on. So Ari wasn't listening, but he was taking the IAT, or maybe he's really super good at multitasking. So thank you for that, Ari.
ADHD.
So it's fun. So and similarly in education, there are studies that show that if people who are reviewing writing have the sense that the person who wrote something is a person of color, they're actually more likely to treat it more harshly and have lower expectations for the person who wrote it than if the person were white. So I just want to spend a second talking about privilege and microaggressions, and then I want to move on and have you do a couple of things here for us. So on the screen, I want to just kind of talk about privilege for just a second. Privilege is, again, one of those things that gets thrown around a lot as an accusation. God forbid, right? Somebody tells you that you're privileged, right? It feels like an assault, right, on you, right? Your privilege is showing, right? And so I want to just talk to you for a second about this chart that you can see on the screen. If you are ever interested, you can Google axes of privilege and oppression, and some version of this chart would come up, and you can take a look at it more closely. But what you see here, is a wheel, right, and spokes on the wheel, and each kind of each spoke really represents a particular characteristic, like identity characteristic. And these aren't all the identity characteristics that exist. These are the ones that the person who created this chose. But what it tends to show is that everything that's above kind of this equator is viewed as a privileged characteristic. And what's below the equator is regarded by this chart as an oppressed characteristic. And so let me try to describe what happened my first time looking at this. So I'm a Black man in the United States of America, right? And somebody asked me to do a privilege and oppression evaluation for myself, right? And I said, well, look, I'm a Black man, I'm oppressed, right? That's when you look up oppressed in the dictionary, you see Black man next to it, right? And so what happened when I started to go through this? I'm a male and I'm masculine, right? So I'm cisgender, right? I identify with the gender that I was given at birth. I'm a man, which gives me advantage. I am a person of color. That's below the equator. I'm not European in origin, right? But I'm heterosexual. I'm able-bodied. I'm credentialed, highly literate. I'm not so young anymore, but I am extremely attractive. I'm upper middle class. I speak English as a first language. Even within my race, I tend to have lighter skin, which gives me some advantage. I'm from a majority religion, right? And I've got 2 kids who are my own, biologically. And what does that mean to me, right? That means that I am in most regards an extremely privileged person, right? But I think what's interesting for me, at least, is to think about what does it mean to be on the other side of the scale, on any one of these lines where I am somebody who is who would be regarded as privileged. What is it like to be on the other side of this, right? So I'm a male, and so that would be regarded as a privileged perspective. What are the things that I maybe don't have to worry about that somebody who is female has to worry about? Well, I don't have to worry about necessarily getting, being viewed as, that women can be viewed as aggressive and off-putting in situations where men would just be regarded as assertive, right, or confident. I am cisgender, which means I was born and identified as a boy when I was born, and I identify personally as a male, as a man. What is it like to be transgender, right, on the other side? I personally never have to think about, if I go into any building in anywhere, whether there's going to be a restroom where I can feel comfortable going to the bathroom. If I'm transgender, I worry about that everywhere I go. Right? It's just like an added weight that a person has to carry. So when you hear people talking about privilege, I think sometimes we equate it with advantage. And I really think it's more kind of like the absence of things, right? Just like weights or burdens that you don't have to carry with you all of the time, right? And so I think if you think about it in that way, like maybe it's less of a, it feels like less of an accusation, but maybe it's an opportunity for us to have a little bit of empathy for those who exist below the equator on one or more of these identity characteristics. Rachel, is there anything I'm missing? I don't have the chat up, and I just want to make sure that I'm not missing anything in the chat.
There's one question or one comment. It says, I might make an implicitly biased choice based on names. Whoops. But it wouldn't be, sorry. I'm so sorry, I just lost it.
Oh, that's okay.
Somebody typed something and it pushed me. Let me get back to it. Yeah. But it wouldn't be because I think they're Black so much as I think they might be poor and couldn't afford transportation to work.
Yeah, so there may be any of a number of implicit assumptions that we make about something, right? Yeah, it's not, I think it's easy for this conversation to become kind of a race conversation, and I think it's important to think that socioeconomic status can be among those things. So if you're practitioners, and I gather we may have some judges on the line as well. I know Judge Siri is here. But what do you think when you're in the courtroom, for example? And I know I assume not everyone here is a litigator or kind of court trial attorney, but what happens in the courtroom and you see somebody on the other side, who isn't dressed in a suit, right? Who kind of presents in a way that, is different from the way that we've been trained to kind of show up in these spaces. And what assumptions do we make about them? Impoverished, maybe, right? Uneducated, don't know any better, don't care. What are the assumptions that we make? And again, it's not even so much what are we thinking consciously, right? But what are the ways in which that might just kind of cause us to have, again, that slightly kind of distancing feeling, right? Like that I'm put off by what I see. There's a really interesting article, which if anybody's interested, let Ari know and I will get it to you, but it's about the Trayvon Martin case. And one of the primary witnesses in the Trayvon Martin case was, I think, a friend of Trayvon Martin's. And if you don't remember, Trayvon Martin is the young boy who was shot by Zimmerman in Florida. This is kind of the stand your ground case in Florida, if you don't remember that. And so in Zimmerman's criminal trial, this witness testified, and there's really interesting studies that focus on that particular case. And because she was a star witness and she did not speak perfect kind of standard American English, that there's a tendency to kind of discount her, right? To discount and view that testimony, right, as less trustworthy, right? And so how might that kind of show up, right, in the work that we do? And I think that's for me, kind of the place where I'd like us to kind of be thinking right now. And Rachel, feel free to interrupt me if there are other things I'm missing, but I'm going to kind of.
There's just a couple of insightful comments. Excellent description of privilege. The absence of having to worry about something is an advantage. And that's how they explain it. So the absence of having to worry about something.
Yeah, so I think that it is, you can, if you take two people and you put them in a race and you make the other person carry a 10-pound weight, right? Like, yes, as a person who doesn't have that weight at an advantage, perhaps so. But I want to kind of maybe draw a distinction, because I do think this is what I worry about. I'm just going to be really transparent with you. What I worry about is that when you use the word advantage, that anyone who might be listening to this or participating in this conversation, there may be most of us even who, if somebody were to tell us like you've just had advantages, right? That like we feel like that undermines what we feel like we've done in our lives, right? It undermines like the idea that we've worked hard for kind of where we are, right? That we have like we didn't have an easy path. Like we know each individually all the struggles that we've had personally and professionally. And so sometimes the notion of being told that we are advantaged or that we've had advantages just may not be consonant with the way we think about our own experience. And I don't mean to discount the comment, because I think that I of course, right, if one person if two people are engaged, right, in a profession, in a race, in kind of any activity, and one is encumbered, the one who is unencumbered has a natural advantage. But I really want to kind of, the reason I really focus more on privilege than the word advantage, just and maybe as simply rhetoric or semantics, is that I really think it's more useful for me at least to think about the encumbrance that other person has to carry, right? And what does that mean? That means that if somebody who has to carry that weight is always running behind, trying to catch up, right? Never given the opportunity to fully participate and compete because they're always carrying an extra burden. And it's really important to think about something when we kind of think about the fact that people we all have multiple identities, right? So as you kind of think about having different identity characteristics, right? I'm a Black man, right? But on the man side, at least, I'm privileged. But a Black woman has kind of double the harm, right? Carries double the weight. If that woman is a Black woman and identifies as LGBTQ, maybe carrying even more weight, right? If they're from a non-dominant religion, carrying even more weight, right? And these burdens can get heavy, right? And because you're getting the looks, you're getting treated differently, right? Like if you're at the store, this is an example. Like if you go to the store and people are asking you kind of in each aisle, like, how are you doing? Do you need any help? Like many of you might think, right? Like, wow, this is a really helpful store. I will tell you that for me, because I've had enough of these experiences in my life, my reaction is they're watching me, right? And they may or may not be, but that's a burden that I'm carrying, right? So that I'm never fully relaxed, never fully comfortable, right? When I'm speaking to you, I use words like ubiquitous, right? Just so that you know that I've got like the vocabulary, right? And that I'm educated, right? I don't have to, and I do that sometimes consciously because I don't want any kind of prejudgment of who I am based on my race to kind of interfere with my ability to communicate. Right? It's a simple and stupid little thing, but it's just added burdens that those of us from different groups might carry. Rachel.
I have a couple things that mention it about clients. Co-counsel sometimes resist having our low-wage worker clients testify for the same reason, and even devalue our chances of succeeding with their case. And then Dana has asked, what is your opinion of the Malcolm Gladwell book? He thinks it's called Talking to Strangers.
I have not read Talking to Strangers. I've read a couple of his books, but not that one, so I can't comment on it. I think that he does a good job of translating, just generally does a good job of translating science in a way that's accessible. So I can't comment on that book specifically, but and I don't really even know its content, so I don't want to try to comment on on that at all. But just as an author, I think he does a pretty good job of communicating science in a way that's accessible.
I mean, I think, the other comments are just making our kids aware. This is, I think moving to the next step, like, okay, these are the things we're learning. Now, what can we do with it?
Great. Yeah. So here's what I would like to do. I think it would be great to just have each of you. We have about 20 minutes left, and I want to do a couple of quick things. And this is much more about you. And certainly, if you have questions, feel free to post them. But I would like you to spend 2 or 3 minutes. If you have a piece of paper or you want to use your computer and just open up a Word document or something, I would love for you to just make a list of ways in which you can envision this might have an impact in our profession. What are the ways in which bias and the way that we're discussing it can have an impact on our profession? I'm going to give you, I'm just going to be quiet for a couple of minutes and give you a couple of minutes to think about that and to write that down on your own.
Do you want the attendees to then post it in the chat? How would you like to? Or
no, just for this moment, I'd love for you just to kind of be reflective for yourselves. In a moment, what I will do is share a document with the group, a Google document that we can kind of group source and start to put some of that stuff in the chat together. But I'm not going to go there quite yet. So I'm going to give it 2 minutes. Rachel is going to post in the chat here in a minute a link to a Google Doc. For those of you who, I don't know if everybody knows what a Google Doc is or not. A Google Doc is a document that we can all edit at exactly the same time. So it's kind of a cool way to be able to engage. And so what you have, let me put it on the screen for you. Just a second here. I'll show you kind of what it looks like. So, and Rachel, did you have that link? If not, yeah, you can go ahead and post it. Maybe you have already, I just didn't see it. But what you can do is in this chart, just you'll see that there are kind of topics that we can raise and the ways in which it might show up in in our profession. And so this might include, I have two examples here that I put in here for you. But I would love for you just over the next 5 minutes or so, maybe just to add some things for yourselves. I'm going to go ahead. I was hoping originally we might do this in breakout groups, but because everybody's going to be doing this individually, it means I'm going to have to add a lot more rows to this. So I'm going to do that kind of while you're working on it. So just click on an empty row and you can you'll be able to make your edits. But I'd just love to see what you come up with. And even if you want to reflect on this and add some more to this after our meeting today, hold on to the link and you'll be able to add to it, because I think it could be really helpful for us to see, not just what do I think, right? But where do you think this can be potentially problematic? So I'm adding a lot of rows here. So just click anywhere where you see a row and feel free to share as many different thoughts as you might have. And we won't have time to read the whole document, but what I'm hoping is that we can kind of group source some thoughts here about the ways bias might have an impact on the profession. I may comment on some of these just as they're popping in. So someone has added sentencing that the person believes that on average African-American males get higher sentences in certain cases than white males. Like, you don't have to, it's not anecdotal, it's actually been scientifically measured, right? That like the data actually bear that out, that African-American males, African-Americans generally, people of color generally get higher sentences than whites do for common crimes. Something that would be useful, especially for those of you who are in criminal practice, either prosecutors, defenders, or even judges who have criminal dockets. If you're not aware of the phrase school to prison pipeline, we don't have time to really talk about it here today, but that would be something for you to be thinking about, that the people that you're seeing in front of you often are a product of a system that kind of has a tendency to direct them that way. In other words, school discipline, not unlike sentencing, is meted out disproportionately to people of color. That's been studied in Maryland, and the Maryland State Department of Education has been taking a look at how do they deal with that effectively. Courtroom bias. Somebody has said judges assume attorneys of color are parties. So I've heard many people kind of raise the idea that they might show up for a docket, and even had one person tell me recently that they went to move from the gallery up to counsel table and were told they weren't allowed to because only lawyers were allowed there. And I would bet, and I know this from talking to some of our judges, that some judges of color, if they are not in their robes, are often regarded as not given the respect that they might get if they were in their robes. Somebody has mentioned SINA cases, right? And you can just think about how in the context of child welfare matters, how we might, our perception of the people who are involved in those matters might affect outcomes. And what's interesting is that we can look, and the person who's commented here has said judges or magistrates may not be aware of their own biases and it can affect the outcome. I think it's also really important, and some people have really begun to look at this, is to what extent might bias impact the way that the ways that we advocate. And SINA cases are a little bit different because you really are working in the best interest of the child, hopefully, right? But it may be that even the person who's representing the child may have certain kinds of perspectives or biases that might affect the outcome because they're advocating in a particular direction or believe that a particular direction is more in the best interest of a child than another. I'm going to give this a couple more minutes, and I thank you so much for your willingness to share with us. Someone has made reference to bar associations and just said lack of mentoring, right? And I think that, certainly one of the things that we would want to turn our attention to in this discussion, and certainly I think in addition, thinking about what do we talk about 2 weeks from now, would really be to think more concretely, like what does this mean? What does all of this mean, right? If you are with me, right, if you accept some of the things that I'm sharing with you today, what does this mean for the Baltimore County Bar Association, right? Is it diverse? And if not, why not, right? If somebody has again put mentoring in the document, is that a part of what the Bar Association does? Does it happen organically? Do we, how good a job do you do of reaching out and connecting to people who are part of the Baltimore County Bar, who are practicing in Baltimore County? Do people feel included, right? Not just like that the door is open, right? But like, are you reaching out? Are you going outside the door and saying, hey, we'd like you to be a part? So we have about 8 minutes left here, and I just want to make sure that I create space for any of you to ask questions or express thoughts that any thoughts that you might have before we break. I think if it's okay with Ari, Sandy, Rachel, and others, I think that it might be a good opportunity to maybe ask some and answer questions, and then this will give us this chart that you're all working on will give us an opportunity to do a little bit of reflection, I think, to see kind of where our attention should be in 2 weeks. Does that sound like an okay plan?
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a great plan.
Okay.
So we have
Dean
a
McLean,
couple.
could I ask you a question?
By all means, yeah. I'm hoping that people will ask questions, so please go for it.
I would like to know, what do you think is a good way that we can respond to some of our friends and colleagues who, when you talk about this programs like this, like the one we're going to have in 2 weeks, say, well, I don't need to listen to that. I'm not biased. I'm a nice person. I'm kind to all people. So it just doesn't affect me, and I'm not interested in attending that. I definitely got some of that when I was talking to some friends and colleagues about this program and why I felt it was important.
Right.
And I used to say that one of the things that sometimes makes you just a stronger human being is just appreciating other people's perspectives and knowing what they are. I think everyone has bias, and I think appreciating everyone's perspectives makes you a better person. I was curious how you might handle some of those questions if it was presented to you when you were talking to somebody about the importance of programs like the one that we're all here for today.
Sure. So I think the first thing I would say is that we are all at different points on our journey, right? And so like not everybody's ready, right? Not everybody feels like this is something they're ready to participate in. And I think we have to be okay with it. That would be the first thing that I would say, right? That I'm not big on twisting anybody's arm to think the way I think or do things the way I do them, right? Or to even want to come and attend something like this. But I do think that if we maybe have, and kind of maintain an open heart, I don't want to get too kind of touchy feely, but right, but those things we talked about at the beginning, being humble and and authentic and vulnerable and have empathy and be non-judgmental, that perhaps we might people might begin to see that spaces like this are safe for them to attend without feeling like they're being accused the entire time of being a racist, right? So so for me, let me just kind of try to share a little bit or expose like a little bit of empathy that I hope I have. For all the things that I might talk about in the ways in which bias might have an impact on marginalized groups, like I really do think that there are many people in the world who, in our country, in our states, surely, who just believe they're good people, right? Like, and it is really exhausting to feel like you're always on the defensive with someone calling you somethingist. I think that can be really challenging. I think that can, and it can have the result, in my view, um, of erecting barriers to having further conversations on the topic, right? And so I think sometimes when you are experiencing resistance to people who have been invited to participate in these kinds of programs, it may be the product of that kind of prolonged discomfort, kind of that chronic sense of being regarded as a bad person. And so, for my own part, and I pretty much have just shown you today, right? Kind of this is who I am, but like my goal isn't to like tell anybody they're a bad person, right? But it's really just to kind of think about like, hey, like I think this stuff matters. Like it seems important to me, and I I also try to root it a bit in science to say that like it's not me just like saying you should do this for moral reasons or like because I feel like it's important, but science actually shows that these dynamics are real, right? And we haven't even yet had the opportunity to talk about things like the ways in which diversity and inclusion can actually increase productivity within organizations, right? That like being a more inclusive organization, being a more inclusive firm can actually increase your firm's productivity if people feel like they belong and are engaged in the work that they're doing there, right? So there's the moral case, there's a scientific case, and then ultimately there's a business case. But I think really we just give people the time, to come around if they will. Some people won't, and that's okay too. So.
Dean, I have a question that was submitted actually in advance.
Okay.
This is actually perfect time. For law firms that are looking to do some internal DEI work on their own structures and organization, et cetera, and recognizing that this movement should not be led by a bunch of old white men, but rather we should be listening and following the voices and experiences of our staff and partners of color. But how do we balance that when, for example, the BIPOC folks are already stretched so thin that they don't have the bandwidth to do the work?
So I think that it's really brought up a really interesting and important point that, if you have, people who are statistical minorities in your firm and they invariably get loaded with doing this work as well, right? So it's often, the Black partner who has to kind of run the diversity and inclusion, committee in the firm, right? Or the woman partner or the women partners who have to ensure that they're advocating for women within the firm. And so I think that there is something to be said about allyship and really kind of for developing the competency to do this so that these kind of invisible, they're kind of referred to as kind of like invisible burdens, right? That this additional work, right? That it's not billable, right? It's not like it doesn't count, right? Towards anybody's promotion, or advancement, professional advancement, but nevertheless, it's additional work that they have to do. That thinking about how do you spread the burden across the firm and take, you have to decide if you're talking about a firm, for example, you have to decide that this is a part of our firm's values and is something that we regard as being important. And then if that's true, then you spread the wealth, right? You spread it across the firm and see that it's a part of the ethos of the firm rather than a particular person's job to kind of really carry that weight. I hope that was responsive.
I think it was yes, thank you. Thank you. So Snehal is saying, yep. So actually, Snehal mentions the challenge, and I know Ari had mentioned that. So now is probably a good time before a few people drop off and we end to thank everybody, to thank the Professionalism Committee, the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and also the MSBA and their Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We thank you all very much. We are offering a challenge. It's a 21 weeks in 2021 challenge. For anyone who's interested, it is covered by sponsors, so there is no charge. We will have the American Society of Black Psychologists will be hosting that. So please, 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 if you would like to commit, please consider doing that. You can do that. Just go to our calendar. March 30th is the first discussion date. So for 21 weeks, you'll get materials emailed to you each week, and every 4 weeks, we'll meet to discuss the materials. And Snehal was mentioning that one of the things, allyship, is one of our next steps. So thank you, everybody. I don't know, do you have anything more to say, Dean, before we meet again on the 25th, or Ari or Sandy?
I'm sure we'll send something out before the meeting, but thanks everybody for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Likewise, I hope to see everybody for the continuation of this, and thank you everybody for your hard work and attending. This was amazing.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great day. Thank you.